Hi, hello, welcome back to this channel. I'm Mafalda, and in this video, I want to dive deep into what trauma is from a more spiritual and shamanic perspective. I wanted to start by saying that I really appreciate your patience. I have been offline for the last couple of weeks as I myself have been dealing with some stuff that came to the surface, some stuff that was still a little bit unconscious in me and that really needed to come up as I'm stepping further into this arena, making myself more visible, owning and using my voice. And so, yes, it's there was some clearing to do. So thank you for your patience. I do want to say that it only makes me come back stronger and more certain of my purpose and of this calling. It's not always easy to follow it, and my ego certainly would love to stay small and hide, but ultimately, as I embody more and more of my true self, it just becomes almost impossible not to. So here I am. Without further ado, let's talk about trauma from a spiritual shamanic perspective. So, the one thing to have in mind is that from a spiritual perspective, we're talking about a state of soul loss. That's how, in fact, that's more so even from a shamanic perspective. That's how we describe the state of trauma, is a state of soul loss. It's also referred to as soul fragmentation, and Carl Jung utilizes that nomenclature, soul fragmentation. So what is it, right? What is this state of soul loss? Soul loss occurs when you experience a traumatic event, and through the state of shock, there's a part of you, the part that absorbs that shock, becomes fragmented off. It's basically cut off from the system. And it can be seen, and this is in Sarah El-Khaldi's words. In fact, she has a great video on soul loss if you want to check it out. The Alchemist, that's how she goes by, The Alchemist. It can be seen as a loop. It's looping, this part of you is looping in your nervous system, and it exists on all levels of existence. So it'll have a mental expression, an emotional expression, and even a physical and energetic expression. So this is how we can start building bridges between all these different perspectives on trauma. Remember when in the last video I was talking about trauma being the state of living in the past and repeating unconsciously? You see how that bridges with this concept of this fragmented part of you that's looping on itself. And so because it's fragmented, it's not operating in coherence with the rest of the system. It's not working towards the whole. It's separate. It's been shamed. It's been shunned. So this state of soul loss comes from this injury. It's an injury to the psyche, just like we saw from a neuroscientific perspective. And so what happens is that because that part of ourselves is running in a loop on our nervous system, it's going to dysregulate the nervous system. There's a chaos. If you think about it, we are whole. But if there's all these bits of ourselves that are fragmented off, the whole is operating in a chaotic state where there's no coherence between its different parts. And this can be, in fact, really complex because we can have all kinds of different parts of ourselves that have been shunned and shamed, etc. And it's usually pieces of ourselves that are really, really painful. And that's why we don't want to go there. And when we talk about the shadow or our subconscious, it's just the amalgamation of all these different parts of ourselves. Because think about it, we're not conscious of them. We've fragmented them off. So our shadow is made up of all these bits, and it's painful to go there. That's why we don't want to go there. And that's why we end up numbing. We end up finding coping mechanisms to numb ourselves from this pain. Now, this can show up in all kinds of different ways, as we saw in the previous video, from rage. It can go from rage issues to complete numbness and everything in between that. You can exhibit anxiety, just chronic dysregulation, and also just deep existential grief and a sadness that feels overwhelming. So in terms of the definition of trauma from this perspective, I really like Sarah El-Khaldi's definition. In fact, I would utilize it as my own. And I also feel like it's completely in line with the definition that Dr. Bessel van der Kolk puts forward, which is something that happens that is too overwhelming for the body-mind-spirit complex to process. Because it's so overwhelming, it gets fragmented off. The system can't cope. It feels like it's too much. So, okay, it's too much for me to survive. It kicks in that survival mechanism, the survivalist energy, and is like, okay, it's going to be too much for me to handle. It's going to be too much for me to handle. I can't survive if I allow this bit, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to cut it off. No. I'm going to cut it off. And so basically, living in a state of soul loss is living in a state where you are less of who you are. Think of it, all these bits fragmented off. That's why you feel disconnected from yourself. That's why you don't know who you are, because you're literally all cut up into pieces. And all these bits carry beliefs and emotions that are untrue, that are unlike the truth of who you are. So you can imagine what it feels like to live in this state. And, a lot of you, I'm sure, know personally what it feels like to live in this state. And so that's why when we talk about healing from a spiritual and shamanic perspective, we're talking about soul retrieval. We're talking about soul reintegration. We're talking about going to meet all those bits of ourselves and saying, you know what, it's safe for you here now. I'm here. It felt too overwhelming for the system back then, but now I can hold you. And that's when you can bring all of it in. And that's when you can be more present. Remember when in the past video I was talking about living in the past, staying stuck in the past and recreating the same scenarios? Yes, this state of soul fragmentation doesn't allow you to be fully present in the now moment. So as you retrieve more bits of yourself, you're able to be more present with them. As you stop running from the pain that they're carrying, and you see that that pain is just a call, a cry to come home, back to the wholeness of who you are, that you already are that wholeness. It was just this illusion of separation. You had to do it to keep yourself alive back then, but that's not the case anymore. So that's why we want to do this work. We want to retrieve all these bits of ourselves so we can come into the fullness of who we are. Also because I'm sure you've heard that in the wounds lie your gifts. So these parts of you, think of it, they also have beautiful gifts. They also have their own wisdom that wants to come through for you. And in order for you to embody the fullness of who you are, you have to bring those bits in. And especially in these new age spiritual communities, we sometimes want to bypass this part because it can be a really messy process to meet these bits of ourselves that they're basically reverberating in so much pain. And it looks like, to the mind, it looks like the opposite of what we want, right? We want more peace, we want more joy, we want more fulfillment. And suddenly we're bringing in all these parts of ourselves that are connecting us with the deepest pain we've ever been through. Oh, no, that's not what I want. That's not what I want. But that's the paradox. You transform, you transmute these parts of you, these wounded bits of you, through love, through the power of your attention and your love. And that's the paradox. That's exactly what allows it to dissipate. The distorted energy that's around that wound, that's around that trauma, like I said, that comes in the form of belief systems, identities, emotions, trapped emotions, ways of seeing ourselves, ways of seeing the world, they start to dissipate when you bring the attention, your loving attention, because that loving attention penetrates through all of that. It helps you see that it's not true, that it was just a fragmentation. And as you start seeing that it's not true, it loses its grip. All these bits lose, they stop clinging so much to this idea that they're separate from you and that they need to keep themselves alive in this way to maintain that identity that you've created around yourself, whatever that may be in practice, right? That you're not worthy, or that you're always abandoned, or that life is dangerous, whatever you made true for yourself, that you had to in that moment to cope, you know, in the best way that you could with that traumatic event that you experienced. So it is a beautiful process, although it's messy, although it's really painful. And sometimes, as I just experienced, you get hit out of the blue with something that you didn't even know was still there. And you're just like, oh, okay, so there's still more there. And there's layers and layers and layers to this. It can, yeah, it requires a certain surrender, because these wounds go really deep. Trauma goes really deep. There's just a lot to it. And so the one thing I want to finish with saying is that give yourself grace. This is a whole journey. It's a transformation process. And ultimately, the key is going to be self-love. It's going to be self-compassion, to be able to go through all the stages of this process that can be, like I said, messy, challenging, and painful. So I hope this was useful. As always, do let me know if there's anything that you felt that you want to comment, if you have any questions, maybe a way or a perspective of looking at this that might be useful. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And thank you so much for listening. And I'll see you in the next video. Have a lovely, lovely day.